Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran here with episode 66 and part 7, the concluding part of my series on Krishnadevaraya. In the last episode, Krishnadeva stood victorious at Raichur. It was 1520. His triumph was complete. No one could rival him. But the stories of empires never end at a single battlefield. So Krishnadeva did not stop at Raichur. He pushed further north, taking Gulbarga, the old Bahmani capital, and then declared himself master of the Deccan. If this moment was his crest of glory, it was also the beginning of his last chapter. In this episode, join me as I follow him from his peak through a tale of heartbreak with his mentor, his decline, and finally his death in 1529. Before I plunge in though, a word to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make this podcast possible with their support. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. If you remember from the last episode, it was immediately after the storm of the Raichur fort that Krishnadeva had issued his infamous offer to Adil Shah, saying that he would spare his kingdom and return all the spoils of war if Adil Shah would kiss his foot. When Adil Shah predictably refused, the Raya took the battle to the Sultan. Krishnadeva led his army deep into Adil Shahi territory, advancing as far north as Bijapur itself. The Sultan, unwilling to risk confrontation, abandoned the city before Krishnadeva arrived. With the enemy fled, the Vijayanagara troops entered Bijapur. They pillaged the city, tore down several of its grand houses, claiming that they needed wood for their fires. When Adil Shah sent envoys to protest this destruction, Krishnadeva's reply was coldly dismissive. He said his men had acted on their own and there's nothing that he could do to restrain them. Krishnadeva's unrelenting humiliation of Adil Shah, not typically something that warring kings display, was seen as overbearing, even arrogant. Worse, this represented a dark turn in the continuing story of the Vijayanagara kingdom. It must be said that one 20th century historian debated whether the Kiss My Foot episode could even be true, but the sources, Fernão Nunes for one, have been accepted in building the empire's history, and then such acceptance cannot become selective. So when Krishnadeva humiliated Adil Shah, he might well have sowed the seeds for the destruction of the entire Vijayanagara empire, just because Krishnadeva's arrogance, however much it humanizes the man, became an identifying characteristic of and a bad example for later Vijayanagara kings, particularly Raya. This caused Vijayanagara's enemies to resolve to set their differences aside and unite against Vijayanagara, and the empire would pay the ultimate price not long afterwards. But at the point that Vijayanagara's men are said to have sacked and pillaged Bijapur, Krishnadeva was on top of the world, unchallenged and dangerous. Krishnadeva himself left this morbid account of the sack of Bijapur in the verses that he had written in Amukta Malyada, that historian Srinivasa Reddy describes in his must-read book, Raya. Describing the attack on the town of Kembavi, which in Telugu means red water tank, it reads, I, Krishnaraya, Lord of the earth, gave true meaning to the name of Kembavi in the language of Andhra, for the water tanks here are crimson red, filled with blood of the Yavanas. Standing at the front of my army, I toppled the high fort walls that once blocked the path of rain clouds. Yavanas in this context means the sultanates. That word has been used over centuries variously to describe anyone who came from the west of the Indian shores, from the ancient Greeks and Romans to now the Bahmani sultans. From Bijapur, Krishnadeva moved to Gulbarga, the old Bahmani capital, and now part of Adil Shah's Bijapur Sultanate. For over a century, Gulbarga had been the seat of the once all-powerful Bahmani kingdom, from where the 5 current sultanates, Ahmednagar, Berar, Bidar, Golconda, and of course Adil Shah's Bijapur, had broken away. To walk into that city, now abandoned by its rulers, was to trample on their memory. If Krishnadeva's objective was to unseat the 5 sultanates, his strategy was not to invade the country and set up administration there. A mistake that many invading armies have made over history is to run the place after acquiring it. An invasion is a single occurrence. Administration is another matter, requiring bottomless management resources and responsibilities. Very few empires have demonstrated the ability to effectively set up and run government in a foreign country. The British are notable for that particular skill. Not so the Americans by comparison. Krishnadeva did not seem to want to rule the Sultanate territories, so he decided to revive the Bahmani Sultanate, or at least make theatre of this effort. Inside the fortress of Gulbarga, Krishnadeva found the 3 sons of the late Bahmani Sultan, Mahmud Shah, and they had been imprisoned there by the 5 independent Deccan Sultanates. And then Krishnadeva installed one of the sons of the erstwhile Bahmani Sultan to the throne and declared that the Bahmani Sultanate was now active again. Because of this, he took on new titles, and one particular title was Yavana Rajya Sthanapatacharya, which means Savior of the Sultans or Savior of the Sultanate rule. He was now the master of the Deccan who restored the Bahmani Sultanate to its seat. But these titles were not just vanity, they were effective propaganda, and they were meant to tell his subjects and his rivals that Vijayanagara had crushed his enemies and stood unchallenged. And that theatre of kingship was everywhere in Krishnadeva's time. He was astute, he knew that it mattered. Victories were carved into stone, recited in poetry, sung in the streets. To the people of the Sultanate who thronged the processions, Krishnadeva was not only a victorious king, but the new guarantor of order itself, a ruler who had restored balance after they had seen decades of struggle with the northern powers. This was the dizzy peak, a moment when it seemed that Vijayanagara had no rival and the king himself could do no wrong. But you know what they say about peaks, there's only one way from there. And what follows in the years after Gulbarga would show how fragile triumph can really be. From Gulbarga, Krishnadeva returned to his capital with an aura before him. The triumph at Raichur and the capture of Gulbarga were more than just military victories. They gave him a chance to craft a new image of empire. In the world of the 16th century, it was one where kingship had to become performance. It was not enough to rule through soldiers and taxes. A king had to be seen as larger than life. Krishnadeva understood better than anyone else. His grants to temples multiplied in these years. Copper plates recorded gifts of village taxes and jewels to the great shrines of Tirupati, Kanchipuram and Srisailam. There were major grants made to Brahmins. This ideology of empire was not confined to temples and poems, though. It appeared in the daily courtly ritual. Portuguese travelers who came to Vijayanagara in the 1520s described processions of elephants and horsemen, the king glittering in jewels, the streets filled with music. They were stunned by the sheer scale of display. For Krishnadevaraya, these spectacles were just a form of politics. They told everyone, nobles, merchants, envoys alike, that this king's wealth and power were limitless. This theatre of kingship also carried influences from the world around him. Philip Wagner, the historian, pointed out in his essay that Krishnadevaraya and his court adopted many of the practices of the Deccan Sultanates, right down to clothes. The titles that he took, the robes that he wore, the ceremonies that Krishnadeva staged, all of which were the shout-outs to what he had seen at the Sultanate's courts. This was not imitation, it was appropriation. By using the idioms of the sultans, Krishnadeva could now speak to multiple audiences all at once. For the court elite, he was a sovereign who could match any sultan in grandeur and in haberdashery. For his subjects, he remained a charismatic king, the upholder of order and tradition. This blending of cultures gave his sovereignty a power it might not have had otherwise. Diplomatic theatre was just as important. The Portuguese were now fixtures in the land. Taking advantage of Krishnadeva's sacking of Bijapur, for example, and the resulting vacuum of power, a Portuguese general, Rui de Melo, acting governor of Goa, which as we remember was now the Portuguese sovereign state in India, seized control of Goa for himself. This was with the encouragement of Krishnadeva, who then offered to set up new diplomatic relations with him. Horses, cannon, silver poured into Goa, and Vijayanagara could no longer afford to just ignore them. Krishnadeva maintained cordial relations with their captains and governors. He permitted and encouraged trade. He bought their horses and in turn offered them protection and recognition outside of their kingdom. He knew that the Portuguese presence added another dimension to his own power. It linked him to global networks of wealth and arms, and all he had to do was to protect them from the Bijapur Sultanate. To his rivals in Bijapur and Golconda, for example, his friendship with the Portuguese was a warning. Vijayanagara was now plugged in to the same gunpowder circuits that connected Lisbon, Cairo, Constantinople, Hormuz, and others. But it must be said that it was during this decade in the 1520s that envoys, emissaries, diplomats shuttled between Krishnadeva's court and those of the sultans. Some of these meetings were tense, others were merely ceremonial. But all of them were staged with calculated grandeur. A visiting envoy would see the king on a throne, surrounded by courtiers, the hall decorated with gold and silk, the floor strewn with flowers. To send this message of power, the Raya did not need to speak. The scene itself was the argument, and this was the performance of empire. In the center of all this performance stood Timmarasu, Krishnadeva's mentor, whom he called Appaji. Timmarasu effectively ran the administration of the kingdom. The Portuguese even called him a co-sovereign, and for good reason. The chronicles from this period describe scenes where the king himself would break protocol and consult Timmarasu privately, sometimes even going to the minister's quarters than summoning him to the throne. That reversal of ritual showed the depth of their bond and the importance of Timmarasu. Together, they had taken Vijayanagara to the crest of power, and by the mid-1520s, their partnership was the envy of every rival court. Other kings could only hope to have a prime minister so close and so wise. But in the years to come, this very closeness would turn to suspicion, and the relationship that had built an empire would end in betrayal. And now this is where we will take a much-deserved commercial break. When I return, the cracks begin to show. The harmony between king and minister falters, suspicion creeps into the court, and the last decade of Krishnadeva's reign begins its slow, tragic unraveling. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back. In the years immediately following Gulbarga, there seemed to have been a period of quiet. There was nothing, even anything much on the relationship between Krishnadeva and Adil Shah or the other sultanates, and typically when records are so quiet, it simply means nothing much had happened. After years of relentless campaigning, Krishnadeva returned to Vijayanagara to enjoy what he had built. At last, a stretch of quiet. The armies were at rest, the horses were unyoked, the clang of siege engines silent, and for the first time, Krishnadevaraya could walk through his capital, not as a commander but as a builder, a man that could look upon the empire that he had fought to create. It was the calm after a storm that had lasted a decade. But even in this calm, an unease lingered. Krishnadeva was approaching his late 40s, and despite all his glory, one thing had eluded him: a male heir. He had wives from noble houses, alliances that had been sealed by marriages across the Deccan, but no son. And the court whispers started about the fate of the dynasty without an heir. Even poets like the Ashtadigajas, who had once filled their verses with tales of his glory and his victories, began to end their lines with prayers for a prince. Those prayers were finally answered in the summer of 1518 when on the 15th of July, his chief queen Tirumala Devi gave birth to a boy. The child was named Tirumala Maharaya. The baby was small, frail even, but healthy enough to survive those early months, and that was miracle enough for the empire. The birth of an heir set off a celebration that dwarfed anything that the city had seen. This was a festival that went on for 8 months. Chronicles speak of elephants draped in cloths of gold, parading through the bazaar streets, of music that began before dawn and ended after midnight, palace balconies hung with silks, lamps that were burnt day and night so the city glowed even at midnight. From the temples on the riverbanks at the old Hampi to the coastal shrines to Tirupati, the bells rang for the new prince. Krishnadeva's joy, understandably, was absolute and it was contagious. He lavished gifts on temples, released prisoners, forgave taxes for villages across the empire. Merchants even marked their ledgers with the words, "Year of Prince's birth." But that palace where songs were being sung was also a palace where more whispers started to travel quickly. Because in the long corridors of the court, ambition would not go to sleep and had nothing to celebrate. And this ambition belonged to Aliya Ramaraya, Krishnadevaraya's son-in-law, a man admired for his wit but feared for his cunning. Ramaraya was the husband of the king's daughter, a prince by marriage, but a politician by instinct. He was already gathering allies and placing his own men in key offices, and he wanted a future where his hand and not this new baby's would steer the empire. But Krishnadevaraya saw through this. He had lived long enough among courtiers and he knew how to read people, and what he saw convinced him that the only way to secure the throne for his own son was to do it himself while he still lived and ruled. The year was 1523, and Krishnadeva announced that he was getting on in years and wished to rest while his body was still sound. But behind that modest claim lay a shrewd calculation. By crowning his son right now, he would seal the succession, deny Ramaraya any pretext to reach for the throne. And then Krishnadevaraya abdicated. He stepped down from the lion throne, not in defeat but in triumph. The coronation ceremony was unlike anything in Vijayanagara's history. Before the entire assembled court, Krishnadeva placed the crown upon the boy's head, a crown that was almost too heavy for the boy, and then he proclaimed him King of Kings. And the empire roared its approval. Then came the gesture that left chroniclers astonished. Krishnadevaraya bowed before his son, performed obeisance to the 6-year-old boy, and then declared himself the boy's chief minister. Now in this, there was a shift of the old order. Krishnadevaraya would now rule in the name of his son, but formally he was no longer a king. Now there was already a chief minister or a prime minister, and that was Timmarasu. Now Timmarasu was demoted to the rank of councillor. He was still honored, but no longer at the center of things. Some said that the king wished to lighten the load, but others murmured that he feared Timmarasu's influence might eclipse the young heir. Whatever be his reasons, that change proved disastrous. For the next 8 months, the empire celebrated this strange dual monarchy, child on the throne, father as minister. But the air was thick with incense and jubilation. From the palace terraces, flowers were scattered onto the streets. Courtiers competed to stage even more elaborate processions. And the poets, the Ashtadigajas, composed verses. They likened the boy to Rama and the father to Vishnu. To the common people, it was proof that the dynasty's fortunes had been reborn, and the capital never looked richer, nor the empire more secure. And then one day, without warning, all the joy collapsed. During the height of those very celebrations, the little king fell ill. What began as a fever turned quickly into something that was wasting him. Royal physicians tried everything: baths in sandalwood water, powders of pearl and musk, prayers at the temple of Virupaksha. Nothing worked. The disease, whatever it was moving quickly. Within days, the boy grew pale and weak. He was unable to stand even. And then, before the lamps of that 8-month festival had been extinguished, Tirumaladeva Maharaya died. The city froze. Drums in the temple were stilled. The lamps that had burned for joy now were burned for mourning. Understandably, Krishnadeva was inconsolable. He locked himself in the inner palace, refused food, speaking to no one but the queen. And as often happens in royal courts with all that intrigue, grief quickly turned into suspicion. Who did this? Some said it was just a fever, it was sent by fate. But others told Krishnadevaraya that it was a poison, that the boy had been poisoned, and this found its mark. The Ramaraya faction, or so later tradition insists, persuaded Krishnadevaraya that the child had been poisoned by the household of Timmarasu. They blamed Timma Dandanayaka, the minister's son, who had served at the prince's apartments. And once that suspicion took hold, there was no stopping Krishnadeva. The man who had prided himself on fairness, he now saw betrayal everywhere, and he was completely paranoid. So he sent for Timmarasu. The old minister came. He was bewildered, but he was grief-stricken at the death of the young king. He had guided Krishnadeva from youth. He had stood by him through rebellion and victory, and he could not have imagined that loyalty itself would now be held as a crime. Krishnadeva faced him. He was trembling with rage. "I have always held you as my great friend," he said. "For 40 years you have governed this kingdom which you gave to me. When you placed this crown on my head, you were false to my brother, and now you have poisoned my son." No trial, no counsel. Orders were given, soldiers obeyed. Timmarasu, his sons and his brother were seized and taken away. Some say to Penukonda fort, but even today there's a small ruin and it's called Timmarasu's jail. For 3 years they languished in darkness. And then after all that time, when Krishnadeva's anger had not yet cooled, he decreed that Timmarasu would face the punishment that was reserved for Brahmins guilty of unforgivable crimes. They were to be blinded with rods of red-hot iron. The chroniclers described this act with some restraint and respect, but the horror is unmistakable. These were the same eyes that had watched over Krishnadeva through his years. They were burnt away under his command. Ironically, this was the man who had saved Krishnadevaraya from the same fate that had been ordered upon him by his brother. This was an act of history that would never let anyone forget. Later, when all the rage had left Krishnadeva, the truth began to surface. Word reached him that the charges against Timmarasu had been false and that the minister had been framed, and then Krishnadevaraya was stricken. The stories say that he cried out his mentor's name repeatedly in anguish, but remorse could not restore Timmarasu's sight, nor his own son. After the fall of Timmarasu, Krishnadeva and the empire were never the same. The empire still glittered on the surface, and the temples stood tall and the market bustled, and the armies were still paid, but within the palace, the shadows lengthened. From that point, the chronicles start to go a little quiet. We know that the empire still stood. We know that the man who had once embodied the confidence of Vijayanagara now withdrew from public life. He spoke little, traveled little. Some said that he had been suffering from a terrible pain due to illness, and others said that he was suffering from a broken heart. Fernando Nunez records that when Krishnadeva had set out years later, moving towards Belgaum, he fell ill, and I quote, "with the same disease of which all the Vijayanagara kings die, a swelling and a pain in the groin." Modern physicians would recognize that as prostate cancer or a chronic urinary infection. But even as his health faltered, Krishnadeva tried to hold on to the rituals of sovereignty. Inscriptions from these fading years still record gifts to temples, grants of land, endowments for festivals, donations of gold and jewels. These again were not mere formalities. This was his way of trying to show that the order still prevailed, that dharma was still upheld. But if we read those inscriptions a little carefully, we notice the change. The scale of the gifts are smaller, the frequency less regular. The king was trying to project strength, but his body was failing him. By 1529, the pain had become unbearable and Krishnadeva could not even sit on a horse. He lay confined, dictating his last orders through attendants. But even as his body failed, he tried to preserve the illusion of order, confirming grants, blessing generals, and then he named his brother Raya as his successor. But the fire was gone. To think about the Portuguese who had once seen him ride out in these dazzling processions, the change must have been stark. Yet, their accounts remained respectful. In the early months of 1529, or maybe it was 1530, Krishnadevaraya, conqueror, builder, poet, and patron, died. He was about 44 years old. The court went into mourning. The funeral was a spectacle befitting his life. Conches and drums, marking the passage of a body that had once seemed larger than life itself. Those poets now wrote laments. They compared him to the heroes of old. In the temples he had endowed, the bells tolled, but now in mourning. The smoke of his funeral pyre rose above the Tungabhadra, marking the end of a chapter. Beneath the ritual was the unease. Without him, who would hold the empire together? Yes, Achyutaraya stepped up to the throne, but he lacked his brother's charisma and command, and history did not judge Achyutaraya very favorably. Nobles jostled for power, enemies at the frontiers waited for their chance, and this empire did not collapse all at once. It would endure for decades, but the spell was broken. And now that is where we will leave Krishnadevaraya. His reign had been a cycle of triumph, and now it was a tragedy. He was Vijayanagara's greatest king without a doubt, but even in his greatness, he could not stop the forces of decline that had gathered. His death was not the end of a man, it was the beginning of an unraveling of a kingdom, which in turn would bring down the empire. And indeed, it was the end of an age, and the center that had held everything together had now vanished. Around that emptiness, new ambitions began to stir. Achyutaraya's struggles, Ramaraya's ascent, and in the south, the first stirrings of local chiefs who would build new centers of their own. But all that lay ahead, for now in 1529, the empire that had once seemed eternal stood silent, mourning the man who had forged it from war and lost it all to a misjudgment from grief. In the next episode, I will follow all that unraveling, the empire without Krishnadevaraya. The story of Vijayanagara moves from the age of glory to the age of turbulence. All that's coming up in the next episode. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.